Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be back with USPA. Actually, I think the first meeting here was something like 78 at Oglethorpe University. And that was the first time that I attended a USPA conference. Of course, over the years, many of the people at USPA have become, very fast friends. So it's just like coming home to come back to USPA every year and give a presentation. And I really do feel at home, and I'm glad to see all of you, and I hope you're all having a good conference and have been able to see some excellent speakers that have been scheduled for you this year. For my subject this year, I'd like to turn to radionics. Actually, the USPA started off as an idea in the brain of Jerry Gallimore, and it started off as the U.S. Radionics Congress, the first year, which I did not attend. But it started in the field of radionics. And fortunately, the absolute forefront of physics, in an area in which only about 100 physicists in the world work in, is now at a point where we can now begin to put together an actual physics mechanism to explain radionics. And that's what I'm going to do to the best of my ability, or try to do here today for you. So if we can have a change in slide, we'll get started. First of all, one of the great inspirations of my life early on was Thomas Galen Hieronymus and the Hieronymus device, which needs no explanation to this audience, a radionics device. This was the early one in his patent, and I got interested in it because of the fact that he could detect the different elements. And at the time, I wasn't interested in this kind of stuff. I was out in El Paso in the West, and I was doing a lot of rock climbing and mountain climbing and looking for buried treasure and some of the old Spanish stuff. And I needed a way to identify gold in outcroppings that were very difficult to get to up in the mountains. And I hit upon a possibility of maybe being able to adapt one of these things to do that. And I saw an article by John Campbell. Of course, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that article, which really just inspired me no end. That there really was a different kind of energy. The human nervous system could sense it. We may not know what it was in terms of physics, but it was real. It was a matter then of learning the phenomenology and learning how to deal with it. Little did I know what a long thing that was going to put me on, but that's what I got started in, trying to find a metal detector based on a Hieronymus machine. I never did get that metal detector, by the way, but it got me into an awful lot of other things, and of course, I'm happy to say a lot of other people got into radionics too, and that's why we're all here. Next slide. I want to point out, however, something from the absolute forefront of modern physics, that reality is not at all as simple as we've all been led to believe over the last several hundred years. As a matter of fact, if we believe what physics today, forefront physics, has to say about physical reality, it's very strange. I'd like to talk about that just a little bit. First of all, the vacuum, the emptiness itself, is not empty. It is a plenum. A little particle will form out of nothing. This is quantum mechanics. This is not Tom Bearden. It will form out of nothing, and it may be hotter than a firecracker, and then almost instantly it will disappear. It's continually being created and annihilated. And that's called a virtual particle. It's virtual because it happened so fast and then disappeared again that you couldn't grab it and look at it. What's called observable. But if you have enough of them doing this, and they're boiling away all the time, that's called electric charge when it's photons. Actually, in the vacuum, we have continuous creation and annihilation of every kind of particle or whatever you could think of in the world. And it's at such an incredible rate that it defies human imagination. We use numbers just to guess at it as, 10 to the 200th or something like that times a second in 1 cubic centimeter. But the numbers are meaningless because they're so large. Essentially, it's infinite. The fact is, however, that it's real. There are experiments that show these little critters, these little ghost critters, really do exist, and the vacuum's really built that way. It has been experimentally established, in spite of the fact that 90% of the physicists still don't believe it. It's true. Now, the other thing that happens is assemblages of these critters form. For example, just for a moment, you had the assemblage that just happened to get right for a gold atom. The next moment, you might have an iron atom, for example. The next moment, you might have a molecule of some kind. And hold on to your hat, the next moment, and this is a little beyond quantum mechanics, you could have a living, breathing being form for an instant, and then gone. Everything, every possible combination that is possible is forming all the time in the vacuum and disappearing all the time. They call these ghost forms, and most quantum mechanics foundations people do not like to talk of them because it's horrible. Now you're talking about the density of reality. Because everything suddenly became real, it's only how dense it is. And if you take a ghost form and you were to increase the energy in that form would eventually materialize. And that's just an extension of ordinary quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, however, is totally insane, to quote Richard Feynman. Nonetheless, you do have ghost forms, and this changes the idea of reality. Reality is not a brick. It's not solid at all. You have an unlimited number of forms of a very ethereally thin density, but not zero, all the time, everywhere. And if you build a structure which adds energy to one of those forms in the vacuum, you can do anything. Physical reality is hypothetically engineerable, and here I'm going to tell you for real how to engineer it and tell you where the papers are and the fact that it works on the bench. But theoretically, if you have a way to structure the formation of energy into those forms, any form you wish to name, anyone whatsoever can be materialized. In other words, we are free to engineer physical reality if we but understand the phenomenology and how to do it. Physical matter is not like a brick at all. A particle of mass in this violent flux, it's just bubbling like a fiery cauldron all the time in emptiness. A particle of mass is really nothing in the world but a stable form in equilibrium in that mass, in that fiery cauldron. It's under a continuous exchange with that vacuum of these little particles, these virtual particle flux. Now, that form, for example, let me give you an analogy. We've all seen a fast river. A log falls in the river. The water comes by and swirls and makes a swirl behind the log. Now, the swirl stays put and is a fixed form. But at any moment, the water that's in the swirl is different from the water that was in there the moment before. Are you aware of that? The water is going through all the time at great speed. But the form is stable. It's in equilibrium. And a piece of mass in this kind of river is in equilibrium just like that swirl behind that log. Now, if you disturb the log, you can disturb the swirl, and you can change it or make it do whatever you want to if you control the log and the type that goes in the river. You can do the same thing in the virtual particle flux river. The thing to remember is what we call negative charge is divergent. What do we mean here? These slides are very deep. We could spend 8 hours on this slide alone. We're not going to do that. We're going to move on. But the atoms of the world, the way the forms are stable in this level of reality, are by and largely shielded with electron shells, negative charge. And there's a peculiar little characteristic of an electron. When a photon comes in and hits the atom, it hits the electron shell. The electron pops up into higher orbit, more energy, and somewhere around there on the other side, it drops back down and squirts out another photon, which may or may not be in the same direction. Usually it's in another direction. So the photon interaction with negative shells of atoms is a scattering process. I hope everybody sees that, because that's where entropy comes from. More and more disorder. If you have nice ordered photons marching in order into this electron shell, it's going to spit them out every which way. So you're going to wind up considering things statistically, if that's all you think about, and treat them as random variables. Now, positive charge in the nucleus, it's time reversed. We'll get into that a little later. And it does exactly the opposite. Anything that comes out of that nucleus is going to come out convergent, time reversed, And we're going to be talking about it in terms of time-reversed waves and phase conjugation. So let's go on then to the next slide. Because to get at the mechanism for radionics, we're going to have to push physics to the absolute end of it today in the heads of those 100 physicists. And there's actually only about 10 of them that work this deep in it. Let's talk about the observer, because that has become the norm in all of physics. Everything's judged by this magical observer. Well, how does he observe? He is a light observer. He uses these photons to observe with. See, quantum mechanics, even physical force, mechanical force, at root level is electrical. It exchanges little virtual particles. That's what generates all the forces in physics today. And so, in the general sense, we'll look just at the virtual particle part of it, and everything's electromagnetic that we are talking about force-wise in the real world. So, if I'm using a special tool to do observation with, all my observation is done by light. Anything goes faster than light, my tool can't catch it. There it went, and I missed it. And so we're not going to see a superluminal object, and we're going to argue about whether such objects exist. And of course, they're not going to be, quote, observable, unquote. They're not going to be observable with a light observer. But if the observer lays down the light tool and picks up a new tool, for example, de Broglie waves, which always move faster than the speed of light, he can, in fact, observe in a different kind of sense superluminal objects. So that's one of the things we've got to look at. The electron shields are responsible for the fact of the passage of time. The passage of time, as we normally talk about it, positive flow of time, is another name for entropy. Continual disorder. Why? Because it's the photon interaction with the electron shields, and they're always scattering that stuff all the time. What we're talking about is the rate of change, the changes in this world, the scattering level of it. So obviously, it's entropy. There's no big mystery at all once you analyze what this stuff really means at base level. Now, we have defined positive energy, and we don't know what energy is. We'll get into that in a moment. I couldn't find a single physicist who could accurately, in-depth define energy. Now, that's a startling statement, but I'll talk about that a little later. I couldn't find one that could define a potential either, as to what it really is. He could tell me how to calculate the magnitude, but not what it was. We have defined positive energy as being something that had some order in it, and we expend it in this domain that we're talking about, the scattering domain, the entropic domain, and we call that work when we expend it. And so we have defined that as positive energy, the energy that goes out and gets scattered. Any kind of energy then that didn't do that went out and converged and got reordered, even more, added more energy, would have to be negative energy. Anything outside the electromagnetic domain, the light observer domain, the tool with which he observes, will be called negative energy. Gravitation, for example, consists of negative energy, and that's been a great puzzle to most of the physicists. They keep trying to make it positive. It isn't. It's negative. It comes out in the equations as negative, and then arbitrarily, they put a plus sign in front of it. Next slide. Let's talk about energy versus work. The standard definition is energy is the power to do work, and nobody ever defined energy yet. That tells you what it does. It doesn't tell you what it is. And in my Cajun dialect, I sometimes say, I didn't ask you what it does, I asked you what it was. And I couldn't get an answer. If you go to this vacuum flux we're talking about, it's not necessarily disordered. Did we not describe the formation of continual sets of order all the time? There's infinite order in the vacuum all the time. Every kind of order there could be. All the time. So to say that it's disordered is a little bit misnomer. It has hidden order. Right away you blew one of the postulates of quantum mechanics. Because when they formed quantum mechanics, they simply took Gibbs thermodynamics statistics and applied to it. Bang! Stuck it in there like that. They didn't do no thinking, they just plug it in the wall. Well, that's the theory of the random variable, and if you do that, you can never talk about the ordered structure of the vacuum, because you already assumed it ain't got no order. That's in your postulate, you see, and that's just an assumption. We shook hands like gentlemen and agreed to that. The accurate way to state that postulate is to say that it is statistical. which means it either has hidden order or no order. If it has hidden order, then it is not random variable theory, statistics like Gibbs had, but it is the modern chaos theory. And that would solve the missing chaos, which is the biggest problem today in quantum mechanics. We're going to solve it that way and show you where it's at. So the energy concept is nothing but order, coherence in this marvelous flux. Everything is just a pattern in that flux. That's all it is. All the mass, all the energy, everything is all patterns in that flux. And coherence, or coherent order, is really what energy is. And when you take that coherent pattern and you break that up and scatter it, then that is disorder. That is called work. That is called expending you energy, getting rid of it. So now suddenly these things begin to make a little bit more sense. The energy concept, when you apply quantum mechanics to it, what quantum mechanics has to say about the vacuum, the energy concept alone requires chaos, a chaotic vacuum, not a random vacuum. And so we'll move on with that kind of thought. And gravitational energy, that is the energy that's in the vacuum, that's in the potential, that's in space-time, that's in the twist and curvature and patterning of space-time, that kind of energy, outside electromagnetic energy, which is the flowing away of that, is called gravitational energy, and that will be negative energy. So there is a very intimate relationship here that can be gotten at from the sheer definition of energy itself when pursued, that will give you the difference in the secret between gravity and electromagnetics. Next slide. Now, gravitational energy has been modeled and built in our minds as outside the EM domain. It is not, but we'll show how to put it back in there. So the characteristics alone, so far, it would have to be negative energy. It would have to be time reversed. It's neg-entropic if it's outside the scattering domain. The other thing is reconvergent. It's associated with a charge reversal. We already know that. That's physics. And it's hidden from the light observer because it's hidden electromagnetics. It's not overt electromagnetics. And using David Bohm's term, it has to be enfolded. That is hidden order, chaos. Well, all energy, the concept of energy, just coherence in that vacuum anyway. So all the energy turns out to be gravitational. It is sure nice that modern physics begins to agree with that. And that everything is now begun to realize that there's just one kind of energy, and it's called gravitation, or you can call it electromagnetic or whatever. It has many forms. We've got to work out the rules now by which it changes its face, that's all. But it's all the same stuff. Because coherence, the idea of coherence is gravitational. And that is involved in the basic idea of what energy is in the first place. So all energy is gravitational a priori. I don't think that statement has ever been made in the Western world before. It has been made today. Work is the expenditure of that, which is to turn order, to scatter it out of there so that it's disorder. So with those concepts, we finally can begin to understand energy and work and get by some of the limitations imposed in the heads of present physical sciences. Next slide, please. Now, in detection, believe it or not, our detectors, which are all based on this electromagnetics, all detect half of what's there. Every once in a while, another physicist discovers that again, writes up some kind of paper which gets in American Journal of Physics, so you 2 or 3, or some other place, because he says there's an internal energy and an external energy, blah, blah, blah. But they notice that we only go around accounting for half of everything. Let me give you an example. You take a voltmeter and you measure a voltage or whatever it is. Actually, you measure a voltage drop in the circuit. You don't measure the voltage. You don't measure the potential. You measure a potential drop. But you can infer the potential and so forth from that. And so when you measure this and you get your needle to move, the instrument recoils with the exact amount of force that it took that needle to move. And we ignore that. We throw that away. Let me say that again in case that went by you real fast. Everything that physics observes today, every instrument measures, without exception, there is an equal and opposite detectable that we didn't detect that went the other way. And that's called Newton's third law. And we'll tell you how to beat that thing too. There's no problem with that. We can do that. For example, a pump phase conjugate mirror, when it emits A time-reversed wave does not recoil. When it emits an ordinary wave, it does recoil. That's in the literature. That's not Tom Bearden. So unless you want to argue with pump phase conjugate mirrors, you can beat Newton's third law. Actually, it's very simple to beat it. Let's go on to the next slide. This is deep going. We're going to get through it real quick. We are interested in radionics with a more subtle energy. The part that we didn't measure, that all our detectors miss. The half that got away. The enfolded internal energy that we only measure the external flow. Any way you want to cut the cake or say it. Half of everything we've been measuring has been missing. And this is the missing half that radionics uses. And we've got to chase the missing half, not the normal junk. You will never find the answer to radionics in electromagnetics. It ain't there. Radionics is the part that got away when you got you electromagnetics in the first place. So we will chase the subtle energy, and to detect that, there are several principles. These are the main ones. You use the two-stage detector. The first one has to convert the hidden stuff back into normal stuff. There's several ways to do that. The scalar interferometer, a la Whittaker, is one way, the best way. But it can be done, and you get ordinary energy coming out of the end of that stage, and any number of detectors that we have will now detect that. Just an ordinary garden variety electromagnetic detector there. And then you shield the whole thing against the normal junk, and that's it. That's your detector. That's the way you build a subtle energy detector. When you do that, and you actually build one that works, you also break local symmetry, curve local space-time, you stress the time, rate of flow, blah, blah, blah. And the best thing to do is go look at the two Whittaker papers, and I'll tell you all about how to go designing that sort of thing. This second stage is normal, nothing, just pure garden variety. The magic is in the front stage that converts the hidden, the covert to the overt. Now, the other way to do it, a young man by the name of John Schnurra has come up with a very marvelous little process. He has an interaction that occurs when the rate of time flow changes. It's a very sensitive reaction. And probably John Schnurra may well wind up, given funding, in developing the precision detectors we need for subtle energy. In my opinion, the young man is quite capable of that, and somebody would simply fund development. I have the first prototype that he's built in my basement now. So I really have a lot of hope for what he's done. I've gone into a little depth with him about the mechanism. I agree the mechanism works, and that detector can be made to work with enough work on it. And we'll have a new physics when we get it. Next slide. Now, there's been quite a few inventors who have, one way or another, played around with subtle energy. Now, this is not at all a comprehensive list. These are just the ones that became important in my life. There's another 200-300 or 2,000-3,000 that could be added to that list, and I'm sure you could add to the list. These are just people that either their work inspired or affected me, or my association with them direct affected me. And so many people have actually played with this subtle energy, done work in it, but lacked a proper way, a set of concepts and all to explain what it was they were doing. Everybody developed his own concepts and his own lexicon. That's one of the problems. Next slide, please. Beck, for example, built a very long delay line kind of detector, and it does work. And it has been shown to work up against some very marvelous modern instrument, like a squid, absolute quantum state-of-the-art. And Beck's detector would beat it. And it was essentially a special coil of wire. Very special, but it was a coil of wire. And it would beat the performance of something much, much more expensive than that. Next slide. Now, it is a fact that there is no such thing as the physics consistent that we can tie radionics back to. The first challenge you always get from the academics is, tie this back to physics. And I say, what physics? You got so darn many different kinds, and they all are inconsistent, disagree with. For example, general relativity and classical EM theory totally disagree. They really disagree between general relativity and quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics insists that the world's got non-local effects. General relativity, as written by Einstein, which is only part of the curved space-time theory, it's not all of it at all. General relativity insists that everything's local. And yet you can't curve space-time locally. What it insists is you can never have an experimental general relativity. And that's nonsense. Of course you can. There's a very interesting series that I've covered before in the background of why Einstein wound up with the assumption that the local space-time was never curved. I won't go through that again. Let's just say if you find a way to curve local space-time, you're going to violate that and you're going to extend general relativity, and that can easily be done, and I'll show you where it's in the literature. It was already in there before Einstein wrote his theory, but he didn't know about it, neither did anybody else. What we need today, since all these things are different, and physics would have you believe, present Western scientists, that the mind is just a machine. We're all computers and robots. And I once told a physicist, I don't talk to machines, I talk to human beings. And if he insisted on representing himself as a machine, I had nothing further to say to him. And I still feel the same way. We are not robots and we are not machines. We are living, breathing spirits and live beings. And it's up to us to find the science, to put that back into science. Not to say that we're all a bunch of machines and believe in a robot world. We are not robots. But they don't believe the mind at all, or any subtle healing energy or mind energy or this kind of thing. Everything we wanted to investigate in USPA and radionics and so forth, conventional science doesn't believe, throws out, and causes hogwash. So we've got a problem. We need a missing ingredient in the center, and we're going to give you that before we leave, because that's the mechanism, they'll give you a mechanism for radionics. Next slide. Now, there's no way to defeat the non-local part of quantum mechanics. It has been upheld by experiment. Physicists don't like it. Most quantum mechanics foundations people do not like it, but it is a fact, an experimental fact on the bench nonetheless. So, something is wrong with general relativity, because it says you can't have such a thing. Quantum mechanics not only says it, but the experiments prove it. So there is something missing that we've got to find to unify all these things that fight each other and are inconsistent. Next slide. Now, forget this business about a law of nature. That's what we talk about when we try to make a religion out of science. There is no such thing as a law of nature. Never was, never will be. Nature will permit you to do anything in the world you are clever enough to discover how to do. There's nothing prohibited by any carved law on any stone tablet. And all the physics we got are models anyway, put together by men. We only had modern physics about 300 years. My goodness, that's a spit in the bucket. We are going to have a new science. It's going to be a lot bigger than 300 years. Hopefully we'll have several thousand to work on it. And to try to make such decisions based on the fact of 300 years' work is absolutely stupid. There is no fixed, unalterable law of nature. It's just a description. We make a general description of an area that's very, very general and holds for lots and lots of cases. And as long as you don't violate my assumption, then that, quote, law, unquote, absolutely holds. All that says is I build a fence, and if you'll stay in the fence, you in the fence. That's all it says. It's a tautology. Suppose you are rambunctious Cajun and you jump over the fence. Then that law does not apply to you, nor does it limit you. And one of the real problems in science today is that they're trying to make it a religion, trying to make it dogmatic. You can't do so and so. You can do any damn thing. It may take you a lifetime to discover how, but anything is open to you. Nature has been most kind. Next slide. There are physicists, and this is just a few of them, who have thought the unthinkable and are an inspiration in their work to people that are interested in this line of endeavor. E.T. Whittaker is one of the first one comes to mind. His real work, the first two papers that he wrote that changed the world and nobody knew it, in 1903 and 1904, because they didn't recognize what it was, and Whittaker himself didn't. That's where the Russians got their start. The Whittaker papers. Louis de Broglie certainly thought, de Broglie really thought of the unthinkable. He thought of a thing as two things at once, both wave and particle, and showed the particle nature of physics. Got the Nobel Prize for it. What is not known is that paper was rejected. When he turned that paper in, they were filled with consternation. This is nonsense. But he was Prince Louis de Broglie. And in France of those days, that meant something. It still does. From the royal family. And you couldn't reject his paper out of hand. You had to really have a good case to do it. So they hit upon the stratagem. They said the greatest physicist in the world today is Einstein. We will send this paper to Albert Einstein, and Albert Einstein will read this paper and he will say, that's utter nonsense. And then we will go back very humbly and we will say, Prince Louis de Broglie, we cannot accept your paper. The greatest physicist in the world says it's nonsense. And we'll be in the clear. Well, that ain't what happened. Einstein wrote back a letter and said, it's crazy, it's probably true. They had to publish the damn paper, and they didn't want to. And a few years later, of course, they proved it, and some years later, he got the Nobel Prize. David Bohm should have had the prize a long time ago, never will get it. But his work is worthy of 10 Nobel Prizes because he wrote the theory of the hidden variable, and we're very much interested in that. That tells us how to go inside and tunnel under there and control all this mess. Aronoff. Bohm and Aronoff of the Aronoff and Bohm effect. After you get rid of the normal junk electromagnetics, you still got the potentials left. You interfere them even at a distance, and you can get electromagnetics back and all kinds of other effects. They fought that 30 years, and it's true. Been shown by experiments. So in 1986, it was finally accepted begrudgingly in physics. And most physicists today still don't believe it. John Bell, for pointing out the criterion that it takes to have a hidden variable theory, to give you something to measure against. You've got to find a way not to violate Bell's criterion if you're going to have one. We can do that. Sakharov. Since 1968, Sakharov has been telling the world gravity is not even a primary field, it's a conglomerate. It's made from other fields. Not even a primary field in nature. Since the next strongest field, electromagnetics, that we run into, not the strong force in the nucleus, we don't ever hit that much, then most everything is going to be electromagnetic. So I ought to be able to explain gravity's electromagnetics. I'm going to do that here this morning and tell you where it's at in the hardcore literature. Hal Puthoff, for showing that electromagnetics and gravity, the work that started from Sakharov's suggestion is called stochastic electrodynamics, and it's sort of exploded. And the culmination is Hal Puthoff. He only lacks one thing, the Whittaker papers, and I've sent him the papers. If you apply the Whittaker work, he'll really have some controversial work then, because not only will he have it unified from a random variable theory basis, but he'll have it unified from an engineerable theory basis. It can be checked and verified on the lab bench. Next slide. Real quick, we've covered this before. Electric fields and magnetic fields are defined in terms of mass movement, translation, and they're defined in terms of either moving a straight line, which is electric field, rotate, which is a magnetic field. There is another effect which nobody struggles with too much, which is simply the stress. A whole bunch of forces summed up onto a particle that doesn't translate the particle. They sum to a vector zero, but that's a stress particle. And I've used the analogy many times that if you press a rubber ball and you compress it and rarefact, compress it and rarefact, that's a scalar wave. Stands in place, doesn't move the ball. But the stress is increasing and decreasing, increasing and decreasing. And that occurs in the vacuum. If I move now the electron out of there and just leave the forces, what used to be forces, ghost forces, these streams, organized streams of vacuum flux, now you see what a potential, an ordered potential is. That's an artificial potential. If there's no order to those forces willy-nilly and they sum because there's so doggone many of them and they cover every direction randomly, then that is a disordered vacuum. And that's the kind our theory insists we got. It isn't. This is the kind we can create real easy, and we'll show you how to do that. Next slide. So this model's a stress wave. A photon is like one wavelength of a monochromatic wave. We got a photon going one way, an antiphoton going the other way, locked together. The E field sum to zero, the B field sum to zero. That's the only way you can get that to happen, is a photon and antiphoton locked together. That's called a graviton, spin 2. Over on the other side, I plot the stress variation that occurs with this wave. And I want to point out to you something very fundamental here. As this stress wave sits there and stresses back and forth, look at it this way. The density of this vacuum particle flux is increasing and decreasing. There's your way to look at that. That vertical axis also represents a change, the oscillation in the rate of flow of time. You are stressing the rate of flow of time itself, and you're changing it with an alternating pattern. That's what you're doing here. Next slide. The Earth, you see, in addition to the normal EM, we measure those first two things with all our instruments. The translation stuff, when we take the potential and bleed it off and it run away with a particle, with a gradient on it, either straight away or swirling. We measure those with our normal instruments. We actually measure the electron. We never measure the electromagnetic field. There's never been an electrical engineer or a physicist in the world that's ever measured an electromagnetic field. Never will. It's totally not observable. Unless you define the field as consisting of the particle moving. We observe the particle moving. All detection is spatial. We infer the other stuff, but we measure the mass moving. The stuff that we do not measure when the mass does not translate, those standing stress waves, we'll show you where they're at in their Tesla waves, couple everything in the universe, and particularly do they couple the sun, earth, and moon, which is of interest to us directly. We're bathed in that coupling all the time. It's very important to us and affects our life all the time, and all life on Earth. It also is responsible for the heat inside the Earth. In a nonlinear medium, you break up the stuff that's together, it spreads it apart into disorder, and that's called heat. Next slide. Break up the zero, in other words. Now, the zeroed part, the structured stress wave, the scalar wave, and I did not create the term scalar. I took it from Whittaker, from the hardcore literature. And by the way, it's coming back in the hardcore literature. It goes through the nuclei. It doesn't move the electrons, so the electrons in orbit don't bother very much with it, very little. But the nucleons and so forth in the nucleus are highly nonlinear. So they break up the vector zero, and they get forces that go every which way, and they get pattern forces, and they charge with those. Now, I want to say something here that I want you to grasp. I'm going to pass right by it, but please grasp it. That nucleus is boiling furiously, everything turning into everything else, swapping charges away. That's the most furious thing you can imagine. It's in a continual violent exchange with the flux of the vacuum, this virtual particle flux, flowing in and flowing out. That coming in converges, that going out scatters, and so forth. In time reversal, it's the opposite. That going out is really ordered, that coming back in is disordered, and that's the way to look at it, because that's a positive charge on the by and large. Okay, in the nucleus, it's like a self-powered cathode. I seem to be the first person, so far as I can establish, in the Western world that has treated the nucleus of the atom as a pump phase conjugate mirror. It is pump phase conjugate. It's as nonlinear as you're ever going to get, so you're darn right it is. And normally, it's pumped in such a fashion that it gives you a gain of 1. And that's responsible for Newton's third law. That is, if you put a disturbance in there, it'll create the anti-wave for that, the antiparticles for that, time reversed, and that gives you Newton's reaction force, equal and opposite. Now, since you can control and amplify and change phase conjugation, this means you could utilize that and control it. Also, the fact that you can create one of these potentials with a structure that you wish means that you can put little fingers in the nucleus. If you put a standard little form into the nucleus and it's got this exchange going all the time, you have just created a triode. I seem to be the first person in the Western world that pointed this out. You have put in a grid signal. The cathode, the boiling of the energy is free, comes from the vacuum exchange, and the plate energy is free. This thing will then activate. That is, it will acquire part of its, in chaos theory, it will start to apply or gather hidden order inside that chaotic mess. And you have control of that order with minuscule energy. Just put it in there and hold it, and that's called activation. It charges that thing up just like a nucleus. Just like a battery. Has a time charge constant. If you quit putting the signal in there, it will discharge that constructed scalar pattern over a period of time. And we can give you much greater detail on how that works, but we don't have time for it. And that thing then will gradually lose the ordering. Now, this is important to radionics and several things like in parapsychology as well. Anything that has remained in contact very long, that had potentials in it, that had a structure in it, that reacted with that nucleus has that pattern in that nucleus which never reaches zero. It has a memory. Now it gets very small, but it is never zero. That memory of everything that has ever happened to that atom, including you sneezing in its presence, and in fact you sneezing across the universe, is in that atom forever. It ain't very big in there, but it's in there. Remember, that's one of them ghost forms. If you add some energy to that sucker, out it's going to come. You can grow it and activate it gradually. In radionics, we use a witness. The witness must have been interacted with by light. And when it does, that witness has that activated pattern memory in it right there, like the Cajun says. And that is the secret of the witness in radionics. That's part of your mechanism right there. Next slide. So in this thing, we're interested in going between the atoms and the nucleus. Actually, without going into it, the mind works on, and the living energy of the body works on this internal negative energy. And your mind is really contained in patterns that are inside the nuclei of the atoms, activated nuclei in your body. Now, that's anathema to everything in science. Well, let me give you a living example. There is a thing called hydranencephaly. Not hydroencephaly, hydranencephaly. This is the thing where only possibly 5% or less of the human brain is in the head, usually the stem on top of the spinal column. And the rest of the head's full of water. And there are people walking around today just as normal as you and me, and that's what's in their head. So quite obviously, it ain't not a machine, and this piece of the brain do that, and that piece of the brain. Anywhere you get that functioning, whether it's in the brain or in that water, something is structured to function in that fashion. We're talking about invisible machines, vacuum machines, and that's what the mind is. It is not a material machine. And it'll work just as well under the proper conditions in the bond structuring and breaking of water, the hydrogen bonding structure, as it will in the vacuum in the nuclei. As long as you've got a stable pattern and a standing potential in those nuclei, that's where the mind is. And we will be able to build instruments and go in there and change whatever we need to change. We'll do it for good or bad. They can eventually, we'll be able to pull your personality out, stick something else in, put anything in there they want. That's the bad part. The good part is they can also put a full PhD in physics, a full doctorate in medicine, a doctorate in this, a doctorate in that. 20 years, we can do that. Can't do it today, but 20 years, yes. That's the way it'll work. Next slide. A linear medium, you put in a monochromatic wave, out comes the same thing. Put it in from the other side, out comes the same thing. No big deal. What you get in is what you get out. A nonlinear medium, the only definition for it is it don't work that way. You can't believe what a struggle it took to arrive at what the definition of nonlinear medium was. But anyway, you put in this monochromatic wave, and out comes a whole bunch of harmonics. Now, I want to put in a very subtle thing here. I want you to notice something very subtle. On the top slide, I want you to look at time flowing forward. We've got a motion picture going. Clickety, 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 click, taking the pictures. Put in the wave, out comes the other way. Suppose I run the motion picture backwards. I have time reversal. In goes this wave, out goes that one. You see that? Now move down to the bottom picture. I got this nonlinear medium. In goes this wave, back in comes, when I go back in with all these three waves, out comes a bigger fundamental. Hey, baby, they never told me that in my textbook. When I studied harmonics, they never told me it could work in reverse. And it could be time reverse. We didn't know that until 72. We found it in open Soviet literature. But it can. And if I have nature being very kind, and nature providing me a whole bunch of harmonics over there, that's around free for the taking, if I could do something that would just give me a jillion of them, and I could stick my nonlinear detector in there, guess what I'd get out on the other side for the time reverse stuff? I'd get real phase conjugate energy, lots of it. That is the secret to free energy devices, tapping the vacuum right there. That simple little diagram, if you understand it, is the main mechanism to tap the vacuum energy. You've got to make a super vacuum, you've got to charge up the potential a bit. That's easy, no problem. And it stays once you pay for the charging. Then you put that in there, right, and out will come all the energy you want. That is the secret of Tapping the vacuum energy. Next slide. Now, a 10-cent piece of plastic can do that. That's so hard to do. Everything does it that's got nonlinearity in it, and everything's nonlinear a little bit, so everything does a little bit. Pick a good nonlinear material, and it does a whole lot. Take that same, what this says is, if I have a wave come through that vacuum, through that piece of plastic, that piece of plastic generates another wave, which goes back and appears everywhere in phase spatially with that other wave, but out of phase in time. Over there on that side, you got photons and antiphotons coupled together, and that's gravitons. That makes gravitons. Next slide. If you don't believe it, that's the way they say it in the standard optical literature. It's called the distortion correction theorem. I'll just throw it up, and that's from Yaref's textbook to show you that it is standard academia. But it's over there in the optics, guys. Nobody else believes that over anywhere else, you see. But it's a basic solution to the wave equation. It applies to everything: mechanical waves, sound waves, electromagnetic waves, de Broglie waves, everything else under the sun. Tesla did it with mechanical waves, and he called that telegeodynamics. Next slide. The interesting thing we wish to do is make a triode, an amplifier, and we want the vacuum to furnish the power to it. So we furnish a little grid signal, we get the plate energy, and we get lots of energy for a little bit. And the way you do that is use four-wave mixing, which is an amplifier. I have what's called a pump wave. A2 and A1 are two waves generally opposing each other. And so they've got energy in them. I either add them or I can get somebody else to give them to me for free. In this medium, that'll act this way. And then when I do, I put in a little signal, A4. It's called a signal wave. And out comes a big A3, which is called a phase conjugate wave. It'll come out there and backtrack. It has an invisible memory of where A4 is supposed to come from, and back over it'll go, even to the other end of the universe. It'll order the vacuum. It'll start making gravitons all along there. If I put in lots of energy, I can have all the energy coming out in A4. So I've got an amplifier. I've got a triode here. I call this a vacuum triode, if I get the vacuum to pump it. I want to call your attention to the fact that stressed is opposed vector forces, summation of a whole bunch of opposed vector forces, either two or more. That's what stress is. I want to call your attention to those opposed forces are pump forces. Stressed is a pumper. Anything that's stressed, you can tap energy out from God Almighty forever. If you can get it to do this process and get over gain 1, which you can do under the oscillation condition. Now, I ain't going to tell you how to do that. That's the inventors that I work with, their secret. But that's the principle, and it works on the bench. You can tap stress itself, like the stress of the earth. Tesla did that and called it his magnifying transmitter. That's what he built. Next slide, please. Let's skip on by that one. That just shows you can get all the energy that's available in there, scavenge out under the right condition and go out in your wave. You can get enormous energy from tickling it on the chin. Now, if you have phase conjugate, energy is quite different from a normal mirror. The normal mirror, we're used to thinking about something from a source out here scattered across the mirror, reflecting even scattered more. A phase conjugate mirror does not do that. Apply that theorem from the textbook. Light comes across the mirror, and this can be a hunk of junk, doesn't have to be shiny. And from each point on that mirror, it scatters right back where it came from. It goes back to the original source. So that thing focuses all the energy back to the source. If I pump that mirror, I get a hell of a lot more energy back to that source than I put in. Hey, wouldn't that make a nice weapon? Pick up a radar, return to a tremendous pump phase conjugate mirror, and let him have a blast, like, 100 gigawatts in one pulse. That'll do him in. That'll blow everything in him. Next slide, please. It's been weaponized. In the night of July 3rd and 4th, 1899, Nikola Tesla in his Colorado Springs laboratory detected a strange new wave from thunderstorms and tracked it during the night and realized it was a standing wave of pure potential. It's in his laboratory notebook. And I've drawn deliberately not a sine wave to break up the sine wave fixation in our heads. But I have this wave here and show you what's really oscillating in place, standing from this thunderstorm, going away. As you go out in distance, the rate of flow of time in different places oscillating is changing. It's fixed at any one point, but it's not ambient, not necessarily ambient. Isn't that strange? Everything in the world works that way, puts out this kind of standing wave. And I've shown on the slide at bottom that what's really oscillating is the rate of flow of time, T dot. Next slide. Now, in 1903, E.T. Whittaker, a well-known mathematical physicist, wrote the theory for that wave. Everybody running around talking about what Tesla did, blah, 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 it's normal electromagnetics. Damn. Read the literature. There it is. There's the theory, there's the reference, there's the paper. It's in the journal and explains exactly how that wave works and how to make one on the lab bench. You don't got to take nobody's word for it. Do it yourself. I have personally challenged several universities with that reference, and the fact that Whittaker himself says you can make this wave, it ain't no problem. And at any physics laboratory, at any university, it's worth its salt can do that easily. Any good graduate student could do that. I have yet to have one do the first experiment to do that. You know why? It'll tear down the whole house of cards. And they're not going to allow that. But a few of the graduate students are getting wise, and they're not dumb. When they get that doctorate, they intend to work on their own stuff, not just apply the other great men. There's going to be some new great men in the future, and a few of those cats are going to be there. The next year, he wrote the next wave. The first paper is how to turn electromagnetics and gravitational energy. The next paper the next year is how to take two of those standing wave beams, scalar waves, interfere them, and get back normal electromagnetics at a distance. Everybody asking me, why don't you develop scalar theory? I don't have to. It's been in the literature since 1903 and 1904. Just go read the damn literature. There it is. Don't take my word for anything. Go read it. There's the reference. And if anybody really hot to go read it, I got a copy. The paper's in my briefcase. I'll let you go Xerox them. No problem. Next slide, please. Now, Whittaker wave has a standing potential. As you go away from the radiating source, the potential of ambient vacuum changes. The rate of the density per cubic centimeter of this virtual particle flux in the vacuum is a different value from ambient normally. And that's what is changing. And the rate of flow of time in there is changing. And that blows the hell out of Einstein's relativity in his assumption that the local space-time is never curved. Every one of those local space-times, except where it crosses the axis, is curved. One's curved positively and one curved negative. And that's how hard it is to do. Now, what also you have in this Whittaker wave, what is in there is a harmonic structure. You have waves going this way, monochromatic waves, EM waves, normal electromagnetic waves, and another wave just like it going the other way that fits right in with it, but that is that time-reversed wave. That's the magic thing missing. They didn't know about time reversal yet. If you make a time-reversed set like that with the harmonics in it, bidirectional pairs where one half of each pair is the phase conjugate of that other wave, you have now organized the vacuum. You have produced a standing gravitational wave that you control on the lab bench. You reach into the nucleus of all the atoms, of all the material that you put in there, and you can rearrange and order the nucleus. You can transmute elements. We have done that on the lab bench. You can do lots of marvelous things with minuscule energy. And if you do not believe it, please go try it. It works. Now, the phenomenology is weird. You get weird effects. Be prepared to really struggle with some things that are not in the textbook. But it does work, and it does give you effects that you can measure and detect and say, there it is. So what you have is a marvelous set of waves, all hidden. You stick your normal electromagnetic detector in there, it detects nothing. Nothing at all. But you have ordered the most essential part of the universe. What's there before something becomes physical reality. You are now controlling the molecules in the river itself. The river from which everything is created. You are now engineering physical reality itself. It's plastic, not a brick. You can do whatever you wish to with it. Whittaker wrote how to do it. Next slide. Here's a showing of that bidirectional wave structure. It goes from, the smallest frequency to the highest. Covers everything. And inside the structure, the electromagnetic waves are not necessarily moving at the speed of light at all. They can be very much faster than that. Sorry about that, but it's true. Next slide. What you have established is a vacuum lattice, a lattice structure to the virtual particle flux of vacuum itself. And you control how you do that. Can you see that I can choose which harmonics I put in and which I do not? I don't have to put that set in the middle in there. It's just like playing a piano. I can make chords, you see, with which notes I wish to play. And this is the way you do it. Now, the other thing I want you to notice is unless there is one harmonic interval at least, that's the smallest thing you can have to have this kind of structure. You've got to have that wave and at least one more wave in there. You've got to have at least the one lowest, the least you could have would be one harmonic interval. Otherwise, you do not have gravitons, you do not have this effect. Break up the structure, you get the normal jump. When you break that structure, you get normal electromagnetics if there's any imbalance in the bidirectional wave hangs. Now, if on the end of the projector out there on that end and the end of the target on the other end that it's in contact with, is that if there is a difference in potential between the two, then the two waves, the two directions are unbalanced. And there is an energy flow through a hidden medium of space-time itself, through the potential, from one end to the other that does not show on any detector, but it pops out here and in there with no travel in between. And you move your potentials in different ways. You can get negative energy on the other end. You can get cooling, electrostatic cooling, or you can get heating. Doesn't matter. You can get positive and negative energy depending on the way you bias. Next slide. Gravitons are nothing. Simple gravitons are coupled photons and antiphotons. The vacuum is always coupling in the virtual particle flux, always coupling and uncoupling. So this is a statistical average. On the average, if the average coupling is one photon per one antiphoton, that's a spin 2 graviton, and that's an uncurved space-time. If the average coupling is less than 2, that's a curvature in one direction. If it's greater than 2, it's a curvature in the other direction. And you can build one with a curvature of 1,000 if you wish. It's not that big a deal. You will have one hell of a lot of effects from it. Inertia, anti-gravity, effects that I don't dare say from the podium. You wouldn't believe me anyway if I did, but you can have it, and you can do it on the lab bench. Next slide. A complex graviton, you just stick more photons together. If you accent that, you get a curved space-time, and you get... This is a vacuum engine. You build in that thing an engine which goes inside all the hidden matter down in the nucleus and re-engineers everything. It bubbles out in... Finally couples through the electron shells out in the lattice structure and charges that whole matter, that piece of matter, with that pattern. That's a different piece of matter from the same piece of matter sitting there. You can make it affect the chemistry, you can make it affect anything you wish to. You want to know where your control of your immune system is? That's it, in the human body. A living system, every living system, and this is one part of the definition, has to use this internal Whittaker-structured energy, the negative energy, that's phase conjugated and time reversed, or it'll lose its pattern. If it really operated totally entropically, you could not transmit the genetic pattern from generation to generation. It will gradually be disordered, and 3 or 4 generations there ain't human beings anymore. Well, we don't notice that happening, and the reason is all living systems, to maintain that pattern, continue to use that theorem we showed on the board and phase conjugate and reorder the energy. Now let's talk about one other thing. If I have energy, that's just a coherent signal, coherence in this flux, and I scatter that, do work, and get some work out to do something, but I scatter it into a medium that's got a boundary that's a phase conjugate mirror, and it can even be pumped, because I can use, heat alone, the internal part of the Earth, to do the pumping energy. There's an open system here. Then that will reorder that energy back here and give it back to me again, and I can reuse it again. It'll give it back again. Now, if I can only get a fractional efficiency, suppose I can get 50%. 1 plus a half plus half of that plus half of that, I'll get twice the energy out that I put in. If I get 60% energy out, I'll just continue to get more and more energy. So this whole nonsense about energy being a one-time shot is just so much bull as in all the textbooks. And it is bull, and it ought to be changed. My God, we've had quantum mechanics for 60 or something years. We should have got around to changing that by now. It's high time. Next slide. We've got to get radionics in there. We've got to get that changed. That's universal. Internal energy is universal everywhere. We just have to learn to use it. All living systems already do. Next slide. Real quick, the human brain, it isn't the residue of the translation energy, the normal electromagnetic jump, that's so important. What's really important is that Whittaker structure going on that the brain is making. And you have to get at that with chaos theory. Like, for example, Dr. Valerie Hunt presented at this conference one time. A way to do that. I won't go into that. Go back and read the conference notes. But the two cerebral hemispheres of the brain function as a scalar interferometry by the Whittaker paper. And they can create a little bit of energy at a distance by that exact precise mechanism. And they can sense the activation part, a little crudely, in a piece of matter. They can see at a distance, quote, see, unquote, a little bit by using that kind of distant effect. It's like a distant Aronoff bomb effect. Yes? They have a brain that's a virtual brain that's hidden inside the potential, inside the bonding structure in the fluid in the brain. If you were to drain the fluid, they would be instantly dead. But there are living examples of that. They made a film on British TV about one that graduated with his math degree, and he ain't got no brain except, 95% water. It works just as good as you and me, just as normal as we are. They've been hiding that for years in the rare cases where they see that in autopsies, but it's true. You don't have to take my word for it. You can check it. This brain and the human nervous system, as are all mammals, even the cockroach, is a marvelous scalar interferometer. And it already uses this energy, just like it used FM before we knew about that. It used electrons before we knew about them. It uses this, too. And we have to find out about that. What's important, take a snapshot of the structure, Whittaker structure. Take a snapshot the next second to get a different structure. The changes in that internal structuring that we do not even measure. That's what thought is. Unfortunately, the output of the marvelous instrumentation we have is buried up in our deep unconscious. But certain pioneers, notably Friend Farrelly, who has addressed this conference or this audience before, Friend Farrelly showed conclusively that you could even outgrow the radionics instrument. You had your own instrument built in. There it is. She was absolutely right. Next slide. You have a living aura. This is the internal Whittaker structure. We can eventually, given funding and everything, with enough sharp graduate students and scientists working in it, eventually we'll lay all of this out as science, and my job will be finished. I can go home and go back to fishing, because I'm tired, and I'd like to do that. But that's what we will eventually come to. We will have a new science. Next slide. That's Dr. Popp's work. Pop showed that there is such a virtual system organized in the human body which controls the cell, the master cellular control system of the human body. Marvelous work by Dr. Popp of Germany. The mechanism for everything we've been interested in parapsychology can be taken from the scalar electromagnetics based specifically on Whittaker's work. It's good science, and you can eventually do it in the laboratory and prove it. Next slide. Firewalking. Next slide. How do your feet stay cool? Remember I said you can get negative energy at a distance, electrostatic cooling. And thank God there was even one TV program, and I don't have a copy, I wish I did, of the amazing Randy on one of these islands down here watching and checking the fire and looking at the temperature, and he said, I can't explain that one because the guy didn't run. He just walked all through there, and his feet didn't burn. Next slide. This is a typical thing in metal bending. You've all been to metal bending parties, I'm sure. The Kervran effect, much written about by my friend Chris Bird here. Kervran showed conclusively that these living systems can, in fact, transmute elements. Even though they only got microwatts of power to work with. Well, you only need microwatts. You stick the grid signal in and you hold it, and the thing grows, like gradually charging the capacitor. After a while, you can get limited transmutation, particularly along the isomer chain. Next slide. Chickens do it very well. Next slide. Kosnashiev, this is an apparatus. You put a cell culture on each side, environmentally shielded with a thin window. Next slide. We're going to go real fast here and move along. You take the cells on one side and you kill them with anything you wish to, does not matter. And the light, the only communication between the sample from the same cell culture on the other side, the only communication is that whatever light happens to go through there. You've got to spin it 20 times a minute because you've got to swirl in this field coupling Earth, Sun, and Moon. So you've got to match that and get rid of that, and so that's why you do that. Got to be in the dark so you get rid of the normal photon junk which breaks this up. And then an interesting thing occurs. If that little thin glass there made a window glass, nothing happens. These other guys stay fat, dumb, and happy. And you kill the heck out of the other side with anything, doesn't matter. If you then take a little thin quartz window in there, a marvelous thing happens. A little time later, 2 to 4 hours usually, the cells on the other side start to die with the same sickness. But if you've got germs on that side that's killing them, you don't have the germs on that side, they're just dying with the same disease. Isn't that interesting? Why? Because this is now an educated audience. You had to build little graviton engines with certain sets of photon, antiphoton couplings built into them. You had to build specific graviton engines. And to pass the graviton, you have to have at least one harmonic interval. Remember I said if you break that, you don't have nonlinearity anymore, and so you can't transmit these nonlinear structures. You can't transmit graviton engines. And so when we have quartz in there, quartz will pass frequencies from infrared to ultraviolet, which is one harmonic interval. It will pass gravitons without breaking them up. And so over here it will deposit gravitons with the gravitational engine, with a vacuum engine in it that represents that specific death pattern, and that will gradually percolate up, coupled through the electron shell, out in the lattice structure of the tissues, develop in the cells, and they will die with that disease. That's the secret of the Kosnashiev work. If you put in window glass, it does not pass a harmonic interval. It destroys the graviton, breaks up the coupling. You don't have no graviton engines going over there. You don't get the pattern over there. It don't work. They say fat, dumb, and happy. That's the secret of it. I can't tell you how many people have puzzled over why. That's why. If you had a sickness over there on that side, and you took the anti-engine, the opposite of that, and you put in that little graviton, and you radiated him with that opposite pattern, what would it do? It would move him back from condition A, which is disease, back to condition B, which is health, and cure him. And that's called a priori machine in France. That's the way it worked right there. Next slide. Now you can translate for optical to work in the laboratory by a thing called subharmonic resonance. You can translate it to microwave frequencies and get down to something you can build hardware. You've got lots of hardware you can work with, and work with it in the laboratory. And that's what priori did. Next slide. I'm going to skip that. We don't have time to try. I'll cover it on the next slide. If I start to amplify, grow these little vacuum engines, they grow to a certain point and they establish the pattern. They break through the virtual observable barrier, and so it starts to become physically real. If I continue to grow it, then it starts to distort again by all the other junk I'm also amplifying, and it'll break it up again. But I called that originally kindling. Today I call it activation. It's a thing that's used, for example, in one of the moving target indicator type things in radar. It's the same principle is used and it works. Next slide. It's a well-known principle. We just applied it here. It shows up in chaos theory. If you have hidden order and you start to collect it, that is, amplify it more and more, you reach a region where suddenly the order grows. And you see over there at position 1, you suddenly have a recognizable order. And you reach up here, and by the way, this equation is totally deterministic. It just looks statistical. It is statistical, but it just looks random. It is not random at all, but it is statistical. And as you grow it more and more, then this thing starts to bifurcate and split again, and it breaks up, and very rapidly then you lose all the order again. So you work in a window region. And that is the reason for the biological trigger windows for little weak signals in human beings. They must operate within the region with this mechanism of collection where there's a coherent signal recognizable. If they're too weak, you don't have a signal. If they're too strong, it's broken up again. That's the explanation of the biological window. Next slide. All that the microwave radiation U.S. Embassy in Moscow does is apply Whittaker structured potentials, and they make little graviton engines for the specific kind of disease they want. It'll all be in the potentials. It will not be in the E fields and B fields. Next slide. When Johns Hopkins went in there, they only looked at the E and B fields. That's the escape of the potentials. There was absolutely no disease and health changes occurring in those areas where they had E and B fields. The changes were elsewhere. So they assumed that that's all that electromagnetics was. But electromagnetics, you see, consists of two kinds of potentials. Those potentials which are stable and those which are draining off or bleeding away. That's force fields. Next slide. And the stability of the potential is canonical to the force fields. Bigger force fields, less stability. So when you got E fields and B fields, you don't get the effect. Where you don't have them and the potential is stable, you get the Whittaker effect, you get activation and charging, and you get the effect. They drew a totally erroneous conclusion because they only considered half of electromagnetics, did not consider the potential. They know nothing of the Whittaker work, and that's how they did it. And the reason for it was to stimulate a high target and see if we knew about the Whittaker work and how you use this. We show them we do not. Next slide. Lessitson showed how to break down the brain thing, get at the mind. There's 11 independent channels, 23 all told. They've done work in doing that. We don't know just how far along they are, but they're a whole lot further than we are. The LIDA machine, for example, they built in 1950 or so, can change the consciousness state of a human being. Put him in a catatonic trance. If you think it's hypnosis, it'll do it to a cat as well. Next slide. Okay, here is the secret of unified field theory. If you apply the Whittaker work, this hidden substructure work that we can engineer, the general relativity, it extends it. If you apply it to classical EM theory, it extends it. If you apply it to QM, it extends it. It gives you an explanation of the mind effect, and it's the same area. It combines all of them. It gives you a unified field theory which covers all four subjects. And I submit to you that's the first time in the history of science that has been existing. Unfortunately, in the weapon labs, they weaponized it. Next slide, please. Talk quickly to get back at radionics. I want to give you the final mechanism for radionics. There is the thing called self-targeting. It works this way. I transmit a beam from my transmitter, which has some width and scattering and so forth. Over here I have a target, and that target by definition is nonlinear. It has nonlinear effects. So it does some phase conjugation, which means it creates then this anti-wave going back, marching back over towards my transmitter. Now, if I got a linear transmitter, the transmitter doesn't do nothing with that. It quits right there. That's the end of it. That's the standard radar. But if I'm a clever devil, and I made my transmitter nonlinear to react to that, it gets this phase conjugate wave back over, and it phase conjugates anything in there, and it transmits based on that phase conjugate, which means it narrowed its beam in position 2. It gets back then a narrower beam, and it phase conjugates again, and it gets an even narrower beam. And what this thing does, it'll draw down finally to a pencil beam right on the target. That's called self-targeting. It is the standard methodology that we plan to use from a high-energy laser in space to hold that laser beam locked on a rising booster several thousand miles away, maybe 10, to hold it on one spot to burn in there long enough. Self-targeting. Now, I want you to see something else when you consider the whole potential, and you have this reverberation fact going. You begin to get multiple photon effects in the transmitter and the target here. And multiple photons constitute pumping and amplification. You now start a triode instead of a diode. You start to get more back than what you put in. In other words, if there's some energy around on that target that scavenges and it gets more back in the beam than what it would normally reflect, and the same thing happens on the transmitter, this thing will start to grow. And the energy in that beam will start to grow. And it's trapped energy between these locations. And trapped energy, electromagnetic energy, bidirectional, is what we call a Whittaker structure, and that's a potential. The potential with the Schrödinger equation is the same way. It's pointed out recently by a Russian in the American Journal of Physics, to see if we really knew what that meant. But this self-targeting will establish a potential between objects which are widely separated. And in physics, quantum mechanics, that is called a quantum potential. It was quite different from a normal potential. How? This way. If I have two pieces of junk, and they can be operating junk, and I move them 1,000 miles away, but they're connected by a quantum potential, there is a continuing instant communication between the two. Quantum mechanics insists on that. If I can establish a quantum potential, part of what is going on in this outfit occurs in that outfit. The thing thinks that it's one system put together working there on the bench, although we didn't design it that way, so everything gets in conflict with each other. But every part begins to feed every part. Boy, you talk about your hologram, the quantum potential is a nice holographic process. And the communication is far beyond the speed of light. That instant communication, by the way, has been proven in the laboratory. It works. So self-targeting of the pump phase conjugate mirror nucleus can establish a quantum potential between widely separated objects. And if I get such a quantum potential, I have instant communication from here to there. And T.G. Hieronymus, with a radionics machine, established a quantum potential, which is what a radionics machine does, using that process and the input of the human mind and the sensory perception of the human sensory system to track astronauts on the way to and landing on the moon, or going around the moon. He actually did so and published a report on it. Now, was it mumbo-jumbo? Was it mysticism? Far from it. It was science of a nature we did not know, and that's what it was. He had a little quantum potential established by his witness and by his sensory scalar interferometry of his human nervous system between him and that distant spaceship with the astronauts. And he was able to track that hidden channel, the Whittaker channel, all the way around there. So that's what it is, and there's the basic mechanism for radionics. Next slide. The eventual result you see of the self-targeting is narrow laser-like beams. Tesla did it with mechanical beams and called it telegeodynamics. He said, I can create earthquakes around the earth. I can split the earth if I want to. He was right. You can do it this way. But what you do is you get narrow laser-like beams connecting the nuclei of the atom and maintaining or even increasing their energy, and that makes a quantum potential. Next slide. Here's a slide showing that process getting going. Now, to make this quantum potential, you're scavenging up extra energy from the environment, pumping extra signals. Now, let's reason together. Bear with me just a moment. So, getting this process established is a function of the number of signals around to be scavenged up as pumping. But to be pumping signals, you have to have multiple photons hitting the atom at the same time. So the denser the signal environment, the more signal. I'm not talking about the power whatsoever. I'm just talking about the sheer number of frequency signals around. What's going on inside the electric motor in that, what's going on in the light, what's going on in your own body, and the 100-watt bulb and everything. The more and more and more of those signals that get going, we establish this thing. As we always have a little quantum potential, like 10 to the minus 80th or so, between everything anyway. This one starts to grow. When that happens, take N1 over there. N1 now has a little part of its ongoing stuff that begin to appear in N4 and N3 and N2. If there's no provision for that, that's noise. Do you see that as we add more and more electronic signals in our environment and increase the signal density and the electronic smog, do you see that the real danger here is a very subtle thing which no scientist tries to measure, doesn't even know about? The real danger is the gradual formation of a little stronger quantum potential and gradual noise injection then in the parts of the system. And so your master cellular control system, a la Dr. Pop, starts to have jamming noise in it. It starts to degrade your immune system and starts to degrade your cellular control. And you start to develop more frequent cancers, more leukemia. Catch an area where this is really going, you'll have a leukemia fluke. Bang! All the kids will be getting leukemia. Bang! They'll be getting cancer at an early age. You start to interfere with the pacers and the control mechanism in the human body, and so the arteries start to clog up. The control mechanisms to prevent that are now deteriorated. That's what electronic smog does to you and does to the society. It isn't even in the textbook. It isn't in the National Academy of Sciences, and it isn't in the local university. And for God's sakes, we've had quantum mechanics and phase conjugation around for a long time. Wake up, America, and use the brains that we're calling university scientists to look at this. That's where the increased leukemia and the increased cancer is coming from, right there. Can I prove the quantum potential? I can give you an example. Next slide. When the U.S. attacked Libya in April 1986, a very strange thing happened. There were 33 airplanes that took part in the actual attack. There were some ESM support airplanes, carrier out there, fleet, ships, everybody radiating, radars, electronic support, jammers, and the enemy was radiating, the Libyans were with their defense. Lots of signals, right? Lots of signals. A denser signal environment than we use at our test ranges. And therefore, more frequent multiphoton interaction, combinations of signals hitting an atom at the same time. The bottom line, what does that mean? That means more pumping of the atom, which means it makes little amplifiers of the atom so that the return beams now get stronger, and you start to gradually start a quantum potential growing. And when that happens, everything that's electrical starts to put a piece of its little electrical output into everything else that's participating. And all hell broke loose. The airplanes coming in began to jump and snort and pitch and buck and couldn't hardly be controlled. One of them crashed out of control. 7 turned back because the pilot couldn't hold it from spurious signals occurring in his control system. The others came over the target with difficulty, got the steel on the target, missiles went crazy, they flew all over the place, went off over there on the side, hit buildings, hit 3 foreign ambassadors' residences and all this kind of thing. And when it got through, the commanders were berserk. They said, what on earth happened to this expensive equipment? It's not supposed to work this way. In God's name, what happened? Did we do this to ourselves, or did the bad guys do it to us? Tell us, because you can't operate like that and come out winner in a war. So they did a quick little study of a dense signal environment, and they said, why, this is awful. When you get multiphotons together, you can get all these effects there. They were. They had them. They said, now, what would that have been if that had been a European environment? Because the signal environment had been a lot denser. So they modeled it on computers and all this and ran that, and they said, God help us, nothing would have worked. Everything would have went to hell and back. So they formed a big study, highly classified. I have no idea what's in the study or what the results are, but they're going to fix that. They're going to do some good EMI shielding, because we've been winking at that for years. EMI shielding will lower this effect about an order of magnitude, but it will not eliminate it, because the part that goes to the nucleus, the EMI shielding won't affect. And when you get the formation rate up to the rate that the EMI shielding can take care of, you'll still form the potential. And so this is a real effect, the quantum potential. Now, I bring this up because Sheldrake's morphogenetic field is nothing in the world but a quantum potential between all mankind, see, between the species. The rats got their own, the humans got their own, and everything got many orders of these quantum potentials. So there is a common little communication link between all mankind. There's a common one between the rats, and a common one between the snakes, and a common one between that, and eventually there's a little bit of common between everything. There are quantum potential in the universe. And they are responsible for the exact thing. They are the morphogenetic field that Sheldrake was looking for. There it is, right there. It's a quantum potential. And there are some very good physicists, very few, David Bohm, Aronoff, a few more like that, who work with the quantum potential, but very few physicists ever bother with it or even know what it is. There it is. Now, in radionics, we use the fact that any time light has interacted with an object, the pattern that is carried in that light, hidden up in it, in the potential part of it, a little bit of that is injected into that object, that it's absorbed. And if I have that object absorb a lot of that, like your hair, or a photograph where a lot of light hit it from you, those Kosnashiev vacuum engine patterns that got through the nonlinearities are in that photo. And that is my witness. I can use that because there's a little tiny quantum potential between that and the actual object, even if he's at the end of the universe. And just barely within the limits of what I can get very dimly with my human nervous system, I can pick that up and deal with it, and that's called radionics. And that is the hidden mechanism for radionics. And I would like to personally recognize the perseverance and the contribution of the many, many pioneers in radionics who have carried on in the face of being called illegal, being called charlatans, being called every name in the book. There are charlatans in every field, don't misunderstand me. But there's also some darn fine researchers. And I would like to recognize that great contribution made for all of us by those pioneers like Hieronymus, like Friend Fairley, like all these other people I listed on the chart. And that's what this organization and this conference stands for. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, put it on. Put it on.
You want to answer questions?
Yes, I'll answer a couple of questions. We have time for very limited questions. Yes, question here.
Let me get the microphone.
He's going to get the mic so it'll get recorded. And I'll get a drink of water meanwhile. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your fantastic presentation. I think maybe that's what I came to this conference for. I would like to check with you if the framework which I'm trying to create to explain the moving of an object from one place to another due to a change in my own consciousness is adequate. I have noticed, last time it was 2 ice cream cones falling from the ceiling in the presence of witnesses, actual ice cream, vanilla and chocolate, which was in the deli at the first floor. As I was eating with other people, they fell down in front of me from the ceiling. At another time, it was paintings, maybe falling, no damage really, just signals. And the signals usually occurred at a time when I felt emotionally charged and excited in the process of communicating the nature of such phenomena to another individual. There was, how can I put it, a feeling of chargedness. That's the only way I can explain it. So the explanation that I figured out was that somehow my own energy system at the auric level, where the astral field, the emotions, connect with other fields, somehow was affecting the force which holds together the atoms and the molecules of an object. Somehow it was liberating the hologram imprinted on those particles, transporting the hologram through space instantaneously, and somehow reassembling through the hologram the reality of the physical object. Is that adequate explanation?
Yes, the only thing I would do would be to substitute physics words for what you just said. The only thing that we're talking about is what's called phase conjugate holography. The two cerebral hemispheres can act as a interferometer, and they can form a hologram. They can interfere at a distance, two versions of that hologram. The interference produced that as electromagnetic pattern of electromagnetic energy at the most fundamental level. At the level where we're talking about the virtual particle flux exchange that makes actual force itself, mechanical force, bonding force, all those forces. And so if you can now go down to those forces themselves where they're being generated and either wipe them out or reduce them or increase them, you can affect the way matter is stuck together. It becomes plastic. You can bend forks and knives, or you can actually dematerialize it, materialize it at a distance. Normally, the human being, we have the most marvelous instrumentation in the world inside us. Unfortunately, we do not have access to its output consciously. For example, do you know how your left kneecap is doing 2 centimeters in and 1 centimeter over right now? No, you don't. Yes, you do unconsciously, but you do not know it consciously. One of the suggestions that I've made is that as we develop precision instruments for this subtle energy, we use those in biofeedback training so the individual can know when he's getting it right. He can get a thing that tells him that was the right feeling. And we know from biofeedback training that we can learn very subtle things. We can learn to tighten one muscle cell alone if we have a feedback, to learn when we get it right. And so we can at least establish some control of that system directly if we can get a feedback signal we can use. And in the future, I would hope that we'll be able to do that, and everybody can do that at will, at least to some extent. We certainly have the capability. It's like saying you have the capability to be a high wire walker right now. The innate capability. Doesn't mean you can walk the high wire. You try it, you might fall off. But if you practice long enough and learn it, you can do it. If we had a shortcut where you could learn to do it real fast, wouldn't that be nice? And there is, I think, eventually a shortcut in this area. But I wouldn't change a word of what you've said except to just substitute a physics word. That's all. You've got the exact process.